So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and to another battle which is on a cityscape style map which we have seen plenty of in the past in previous versions of the game, sort of making their return really to the latest version of Reforged for another round. And this is the ADUNAIM outpost, quite an exposed cityscape map for the defenders in many ways. They do have good terrain advantages, especially right on the outer extremities of their defences. But it is a little bit exposed. It is quite difficult to defend if you're going up against a skirmish heavy attacking force as a result. It is a 3v4 on this occasion though, so the odds are not quite as heavily stacked against the defenders as we have seen a little bit more so recently, so they can depend on their own numbers to try and hold the enemy at bay. There is no set theme on this battle either, in a rather similar vein to all of these returning maps really. It's going to be a little bit of chaos and pandemonium. You could almost have said it was North versus South if the two Elven factions on the opposing sides today had been the other way round. It would have been the more northern of the Sylvan Elves, Mirkwood on the attack and Lothlorien on the defence, but as it is, it's the other way round, so the closest thing we have to a theme that we could have said is not going to be a thing, but still, we shall go through the attacking armies first and foremost, as we often do. A lot of human armies on the attack as well, and it is all of the northern human armies really, although there are some middlemen in here as well. Rhudaur and Dunland marching in the more direct manner towards the settlement. Rhudaur here probably going to end up going along the flank with Miho 2. We have the Etenmoor's Troll Hunts, of course. If one thing that Rhudaur have in spades really is the fact that their throwing projectiles are very effective, and especially against more exposed defences like this, that can be very, very important, though what Rhudaur have in their attack, they do lack in their defence. I mean, the Etenmoor's Troll Hunters have more armour than most, but they're still going to be one of the main sources of damage, or taken damage, surely, for Rhudaur, given their own propensity to take said damage, albeit the Frandline Pikemen here that make up most of Miho's main line do have that shield of theirs, which does set them apart from most other pikes in the game, albeit there are more than just a couple in the game now that do come equipped with a shield, so there is that, and they're also pretty effective at what they do in melee as well with regards to their damage. Upgrading the armour on the Rhudaur clansmen makes them the best tar pit really of all the Rhudaur units, capable defensively in melee, can dish out a better amount of damage with those spears than many equivalent units, especially in the evil factions, but upgrading their armour gives them that all-round defensive ability to make them pretty good at soaking up damage in a way that few other Rhudaur units can. Rhudaur swordsmen are a more numerous infantry unit, but they don't have the armour nor the defensive abilities that spears come equipped with, though they will deal a little bit more damage with their swords, and they are numerous, of course. This kind of line infantry unit can be very, very effective when it comes to trying to storm a settlement like this, especially with the more open area in the middle of the ADUNAIM outpost. Numbers could prove to be very, very important indeed. More Rhudaur swordsmen and more Rhudaur clansmen here on the flanks. More swordsmen, more clansmen, more swordsmen, plenty of swordsmen, so a good numerous army here from Miho 2. Another unit of Rhudaur swordsmen here as well, and at the back, perhaps unsurprisingly, we have the Witch Realm enslavers wielding their tridents, more like halberds, at least in terms of their standard positioning. I mean, it is a very interesting kind of unit that Rhudaur have access to at their high end, obviously. Very damaging, slight defensive nature about them as a result of that. But ultimately they do, in comparison to other bodyguard tier units, still lack a little bit in terms of their own defensive abilities when they get closed up and start getting shot up as well by defending skirmishers, of which there are going to be plenty. Dunland are a faction we've seen quite a decent amount of recently. We have the Warlord playing as them. Very, very numerous. I'd say they and the Misty Mountains are probably the most numbers-focused faction that the games have to offer. Maybe some of them... I mean, Mordor can, but Mordor have got more to spend their money on at the high end than Dunland have, certainly. Dunlanding clansmen are here. I mean, as far as a militia tier unit goes, they're not terrible among their contemporaries in the other evil factions, certainly among the entry-level orcs. They have a little bit more about them, especially when they have their armour upgrade like this. Good at fending off cavalry as well, of course, in a very cheap and cheerful manner. But Dunland as a general rule, as a faction, are pretty good at warding off cavalry, as perhaps you would expect given their near rivals. Dunnish warband have proven to be a central part of many a Dunland force and attack in the recent battles that we have seen, and for good reason. They're cheap, they can defend themselves in melee, it's not what they prefer to do, and indeed any dedicated infantry units from particularly the more elite factions in the game will mop them up pretty quick, but those slings can be surprisingly vicious if you leave them be for any length of time. Low base damage, but armor piercing means they're going to get that low damage off no matter what. A few units of them just in behind. Dunland are not particularly good at trading ranged fire with the opposition, at least in terms of their bowmen. The Dunnish huntsmen do give them the ability to do that, but it's much in the same way as their nearby allies and overlords, really, in Isengard, where their archers are more there to be an annoyance to the enemy, and their true damage lies elsewhere. Certainly at range, their crossbows were enough to give them the win in the last siege battle that we saw. The mounted Ravenborn Wardens doing their bit, both in melee against cavalry and with their crossbows against all manner of targets in the last battle. We'll see if they can do the same here. It will make sallying out for the defenders that little bit more difficult. The Ravenborn in melee as well, big armor-piercing damage from them, which, honestly, there's only one defending faction here which really depends on their armour to any great extent here, so the Ravenborn will be effective against them, but less so against the other two, but plenty of them here. Plenty of damage potential. The rest of their army does appear to be hidden, although we do have the Ravenborn Wardens, the foot crossbows, as well as being pretty decent, heavier spears in melee. Though, of course, Dunland, much more about their numbers. Individual survivability, even at the high end comparatively to other factions, is not going to be as high. Tintin is going to be playing as Lothlorien, as we mentioned previously. I mean, very capable of dishing out an awful lot of damage. They may have been on the losing side recently when they were defending, but they were able to do a huge amount of damage to the attackers on that occasion, just not quite enough. The Galathrym Axemen, the Lothlorien higher tier line infantry unit, but they combine it with being a throwing axe unit as well, so multifaceted. You may not be able to get off all of the throwing axes you may want in a quick lightning battle, but I think on this occasion, in much the same way as the throwing projectiles from Rhudaur and Dunland, they can dictate the pace initially as long as the defenders don't pepper them up with arrow fire too much. Lorien Bladesmen are good in melee as a line infantry unit, but they are relatively small in terms of number. The real mark against the basic elven units, though, is their light armour. If you march them in step with the heavier units, it can work, but if they're isolated, they can be a very tempting target for defending arrows, especially when their fellow elves are on the defence. Galathrym Spearmen, here, this is one good example, of course, of heavier elven units. Lothlorien don't have quite the same armour values that Imladris have, but it's close enough to the point where against most factions it's not really going to matter. It may do against the likes of Mirkwood and Umbar, though, so we shall see. We've got several units of Galathrym Archers, of course, a good combination between archers and abilities in melee as well. Galathrym Riders, which are so good at dealing damage with their bows, and then of course that mobility and the cavalry play is always going to be an important factor as well. They were up against the mounted Ravenborn last time around. Today, though, they march together. And we've also got Kindred of Caliborn and Galathrym Nobles. I don't think there's really too much reason to not bring both of these two units, the throwing axes and dual wielding of the Kindred in melee, and then the Silverthorn arrows and two-handed blade of the Galathrym Nobles as well. A smaller army though, but that's to be expected from Lorien, especially when the attackers have a numerical advantage in terms of armies. And finally, last but not least, we have T.S. Niehoff, who is going to be playing as Dale. Dalian Bowman, I mean, one thing that Dale certainly are able to do is skirmish with the enemy, which is Lorien can, but it's more from a damage perspective. Dale do so more from a trading and cost efficiency perspective, with many of their heavier archers, like the Dalian Bowman here, not too expensive, but able to absorb a lot of punishment and dish out a fair amount in return, which is always a bit of an annoyance for defenders when they're in this situation. Some river patrol here, cheap javelins, always an important or very useful tool at the very least for attackers. So it means that every attacking army has got some sort of throwing projectile option here. Could be very, very deadly, depends on how the defenders try to deal with them. The Dalian Royal Guard, of course, sword and board in melee now, so a thoroughly defensive unit really. Not too dissimilar to many of the other human factions, with some Cardland spring to mind, for example, with their Hearthguard, sort of really defensive powerhouse archer units at the high end. It gives you the ability to really dig in, which of course Dale with their upper tier units are certainly not lacking for. We do have the Barding Herd as well, a really good central unit there. So obviously Halberdiers, heavy lamellar armour, means that they're one of the sturdier units of human halberds that the game has to offer. And if they can get themselves set, of course, they're capable of dishing out some pretty good damage. Standard Dalian infantry, so a standard sword and board unit for Dale now, with their armour upgrade as well. Again, like most units of this type, sword and board human units, now that they've had their unit numbers buffed for the most part, some to a greater, some to a lesser extent, but it makes them more useful all round, which is good to see. More Dalian infantry. We did skim over the Blackshot Dragon Slayers just a minute ago, but unlike the Dalian Royal Guard, of course, far more aggressive in nature with armour-piercing projectiles, huge weapons as well, which you can imagine them going to fight monsters like trolls and even dragons if they were to make a comeback, which is not likely at this time point. Windlance, the non-handheld version, of course, Dale's unique ballista. Interesting to see them in action. Obviously, it's got a very distinct look with its 4 arms. We've got the Windlance crew, which is Dalian infantry. Standard Elves of Dale is an interesting bring. I mean, fully dedicated melee cavalry alongside the Lothlorien and Dunland ranged cavalry. They're definitely looking to try and punish any sort of sally outs from the defenders. We shall see if that proves to be a factor in this battle. Several units of Dalian infantry as well. Moving on to the defenders as we skim over here. Interestingly enough, actually, we can see most of this army, which is good. Medexa is going to be playing as the Shire. It's been a little while, actually, since we've seen the small folk involve themselves in a battle. Proudfoot Protectors, as ever, are going to be one of the key aspects of their faction. Crossbows, we've already seen in the very last siege battle, we saw how important crossbows can be, whether they're on the attacking or the defending side. But of course, what sets the Proudfoots apart is the fact that they also double as being pikes in melee. This is a very unique combination in the game, but they are a relatively small unit, and that's understandable given how potent a combination that can be. We can see in and amongst there as well, battling brandy bucks, and I believe... Well, no, actually, the battling brandy bucks seem to have been given the scythes that the farmers of Buckland used to have, so the Hobbit roster may be getting contracted a little bit in favour of adding other units elsewhere, which we'll get onto in just a moment. Band of Brass Archers are in and amongst there as well, one of the better units of archers that the Hobbits have. I mean, it would be remiss not to mention the skin changes here, which are very akin to stuff like the Entwives or some of the more scary units of trolls in the game. Monstrous infantry units capable of dishing out a lot of punishment very, very quickly. Difficult to bring down as well. One of the most difficult examples of this kind of unit to bring down. But of course the rest of the Hobbit roster is pretty flimsy and only really get by based on their numbers, so that's understandable. Hobbitry and arms at the very opposite end of the cost spectrum for the Shire, with obviously very basic units of spears wielding fence posts as a shield. And then in and amongst here as well, we can also see the Shire Guard, the human volunteers that are helping to defend the Shire. Halberdiers, far more basic in nature than stuff like the Barding Herd, but it does help them form a more solid front line, which is sorely needed. The Proudfoots are the only other unit that can really do that, and it helps give some of these more fragile hobbits a longer weapon to slightly hide behind. We'll see if that's enough given the heavy advance that's coming their way, but perhaps they can take solace in the fact that they have a very heavy metal kind of faction here. Red Knights playing as Umbar. Belagair archers are here, a couple of units of them. Should be quite comfortable in skirmishing against most of the attackers today, but where Umbar of course really earn their bread is in their heavy infantry line. The Alcarondas Legion, a really strong unit of line infantry. In and amongst all of these more numerous units of Belagair footmen, it's definitely a defensive wall of men that the attackers are going to have to try and work their way through. They have the numbers to do so, and they have the throwing projectiles to make some real dents in this Umbar armour. Plenty of armour piercing as well, you'd have to say. So all of the tools are in the attacker's favour to be able to do so, but they've actually got to execute on it, and that can be easier said than done if the defenders are able to dig in appropriately. Narun Aru Sentinels, another shielded pike unit, one that was already in the game previously along with the Franadine pikemen, and an even higher tier version, of course, one step below bodyguard unit really, and that makes them very, very resilient and also very damaging for a pike unit really. standard Corsairs, as well as the Corsair Blackguard, the former just being here for the numbers, but the Blackguards and the Fencers in there as well with their throwing daggers are going to be here to try and respond to the attackers. Mostly they'll have the dominance in terms of throwing projectiles, you would imagine, unless the Shire have got a bunch of hidden units we didn't see. Narun Aru Royal Guard, again, much like the Dalian Royal Guard, one of the very best heavy skirmishing archers that the game has to offer, but Umbar, of course, well known that is one of their strengths. Harbingers of Castamere as well, a two-handed sword unit, the best that Umbar can muster. Maybe not quite as strong as their forebears in Numenor's equivalent, a sign that even they, with their elitist nature, their blood is thinning a little bit. But there we have it, still a very, very powerful unit. But when it comes to outright quality in terms of dealing damage, Hidden here, who sent me the battle replay, so big thank you to him, playing as Mirkwood, they're going to play an important role as well to try and blunt the armour-piercing damage that the attackers have in their roster. Elder Council, again, more of a javelin presence. Kind of a weird unit the Elder Council have always been, because as an elven unit they are fairly expensive, but cheaper javelins often perform just as well as them. But we'll see if they can make the most of a good defensive position here today. Several units of them, the Hiriak as well, without the armour upgrade, but not necessarily that important. Like I said, many of the attacking factions have got access to plentiful armour piercing, so its use would have been maybe a little bit more limited. And of course Mirkwood tend to do their business with melee defence and damage anyway. Hiri Lang are certainly an example of that, with the huge amount of damage that they are capable of doing in melee, especially to lightly armoured units. So Rhudaur and Dunland, and to a lesser extent Lothlorien, are going to be quite worried about facing such units. We have the Elder Pathfinders, who have been particularly effective actually when we've seen Mirkwood in the ongoing tournament. But will they be able to do so with all of the anti-cavalry cavalry that the attackers have brought today? I'm not so sure. Elven King's Guard with those heavy axes in melee, but of course they're going to need to use up their arrows wisely first and foremost. The Entwives, another monstrous infantry unit. That's certainly one aspect that the defenders are bringing to the table between the skin changes and these guys. We'll see if their heavy blows are going to be enough to do the business. Elder Palace Guard, of course, a really fantastic unit of high-end infantry. And then finally we have another position over here. Mirkwood Rangers, Elder Royal Council with their Silverthorn arrows, of course. Already mentioned them for the attackers with the Galathrim, but we also have a ballista up here, so artillery on both sides. But the Dalian ballista maybe is a little bit more impressive than the regular one, but the regular one can choose its position a little bit more easily. Woodland Realm Axemen waiting in ambush, and some Hiriak over here as well. So let's see how this develops. It's not an overly long battle actually, so I imagine the attacks are going to be pretty aggressive. We will make a little bit of a cut though, because I'm sure they're going to at least allow the hobbits to take cover within the settlement first and foremost. But following on from that, I imagine it's going to be a fairly quick affair getting things underway. So yeah, I'll rejoin when the battle is about to get underway. So I think we'll just rejoin here, because the battle is going to be getting underway pretty quickly. I would assume the Belagire archers taking up position here on the walls. Unsurprisingly, Dunland, starting off just in the front of the settlement, will be taking the lead over here. Rhudaur going around the flank, but I'm going to rejoin here because one of the interesting things that I'm already noting about this defence is the fact that so far, unless the hobbits intend to retreat all the way back, which it does look as though they may do, with some of these ruffians on the way back, and perhaps a few other skirmishers as well, yeah, Tookish hunters. So all of the Shire's archers are going to take up a position over here, but just based on the way they've initially set the table, the hobbits, I mean, they're not particularly well known for having the most robust front line, so maybe it's not too surprising that they're not going to defend right on the hill itself. They're going to try and pull back a little bit and allow their archers, once they do move into a position up on that cliff over there, to pin the enemy in the back, and hope that that will be enough to get the job done. But of course much of the heavy lifting in terms of holding the line is probably going to have to be done by the Shire Guard, which is what they're here for, but ultimately in terms of sheer quality there are significantly stronger pole arms that the game has to offer. Once again, the hobbits are going to have to really rely on the fact that they're a bit of a peculiar faction. The Great Eagles as well, another unit which of course can hide anywhere, so we can only see them just now. Only, well, a very unique unit in the fact that they can only do damage off the charge, but that charge bonus is absolutely devastating if it connects well. So, I mean, they will be best served, I suppose, going up against Lothlorien, because the damage and value that you could get off very, very quickly would be quite something if you're able to land it, but certainly the attackers will be hoping that that isn't the case. And the fact that Great Eagles are actually within the settlement means they're going to have to wait until they maybe break out through some sort of counter-attack later on. Umbar going to be facing off against Dunland, which they would definitely accept, I think. In terms of sheer quality, they have the edge, and while Dunland do have armour piercing, it's maybe not quite as numerous as the equivalent units that Rhudaur have. Interestingly as well, in some of the recent tournament battles, we've seen Rhudaur go up against Mirkwood. Mirkwood have been pretty dominant against them each time. It's not a great matchup for Rhudaur, but that was with even resources on an open field. Rhudaur, when it comes to attacking a settlement like this, if they can get the momentum going, the wind in their sails with their superior numbers, maybe that's how they can overrun the elves. Mirkwood, far from being alone on the battlefield today, however. Up near the keeping, well, maybe I did rejoin a little bit prematurely. I thought, based on the fact that the attackers were finished with their stacking up on the settlement pretty quickly, that we would see things get underway fairly fast, but oh well. Live and you learn, I suppose. But some elven archers also joining the fray. I mean, Dale also starting to round the corner here. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Dale were the ones to get things underway over on this side of the settlement, opening up maybe with some skirmishing on the very lightly armoured hobbits, and then try and drop the hammer with some of the elven units, although the elves have got quite a lot of archers themselves, so maybe in terms of compositions things could be a little bit more well-rounded. The Wind Lance also trying to push its way into position. I mean, taking up a position over here, it does have a straight shot into the settlement, so any front line the hobbits do set up, they will take a fair amount of hits, which is probably why this Shire is wisely taking cover in behind the buildings for now. Yet we have seen recently the attackers really leverage their artillery far more successfully than the defenders, and very often it's resulted in the defenders' demise. We'll see if that proves to be the case this time as well. I mean, the Woodland Realm Axemen are hidden, but I mean, in all honesty, I mean, it's not going to be the most devastating of ambushes. And if you're Rhudaur, you have to kind of expect that Mirkwood have got some trickery going on. 2 units of Woodland Realm Axemen potentially going to crunch in from the sides. I mean, Mirkwood themselves are a fairly lightweight faction as well. They do have a lot more melee defense and quality, of course, to back that up in comparison to the hobbits. But in terms of pure heavy-duty, holding the line style factions, Umbar are really the only one among the defenders' numbers today. 3 very different forces. Meanwhile, I mean, I guess things are going to get underway now because the attackers have technically entered the settlement. Dale, the first ones to seize some territory within the outpost's limits. Daly and Bowman going to be looking to do a bit of skirmishing. I mean, they don't seem to have fully made up their mind on what exactly they're going to be doing here, the defenders. Those Balagaya footmen looked like they were going to try and defend from the front, but then pulled back, so we can surmise that some back and forth was being had within the in-game chat. Daly and infantry trudging forwards, but the hobbits revealing themselves. I mean, the fact they can hide anywhere is useful, but it's only going to be useful in so much that they can avoid early skirmishing, which of course Dale would want to try and inflict upon them. Skin changers moving around menacingly. Of course, the Dalian infantry would be no match for them, but the skin changers are a big unit here for the defenders. They can only really be pushed forward when the time is right. Yeah, all of these Hobbitrian arms. Cavalry charge coming in. I mean, they are spears, the Hobbitrian arms, but they are fairly lightweight, and they are also in looser formation, so that charge will connect. I mean, that is the opening salvo in the battle. Losses already being sustained, however, by that cav. Dalian infantry now moving in. I mean, the hobbits sort of bunching up now in terms of their formation. Tookish hunters already firing away, and indeed they may as well. Shire guard moving forward. Interesting that the skin changers have been committed so early, swatting away at those Dalian infantrymen with those paws. Galatharan riders firing in as well, of course. They'll be able to get some decent kills on the Shire guard if they are indeed the target. Already the Dalian infantry actually shaken in the face of the skin changes. I mean, a truly scary unit, but again, it's going to be one of the real factors in this battle as well, is going to be how much value stuff like these Tookish hunters can really get off. I mean, they're shooting into the backs of the Dalian infantry, so that's good, but it's going to be difficult to keep track of that. Really, we'll have to judge how effective all of these skirmishes are over the long haul in this battle based on how effective this advance is. I mean, it's Dale and Lothlorien over here, so it is a bit of an uphill struggle potentially for the hobbits to hold on to that in the long run. Balagire archers content so far actually to not return fire, showing discipline in the face of some early Dunland prodding. Balagire archers, I mean, here the Dunish warband, this is the sort of unit that you can't just sort of stand there and take the hits of, unlike entry level bowmen. You are going to have to respond to that in some fashion, and interesting that the Dunish warband there sort of allowed the sluggish advance of the Alcarondas Legion to take shape. And now they will retreat. Dunland and clansmen in behind. Again, a bit of a game of cat and mouse already developing, but as is the way when you're throwing projectile dominant, you are going to want to try and make the most of that. Meanwhile, Rhudaur clansmen not really wasting any time with the ballista, but time and time again recently we've seen the artillery either wait too long or simply get sniped out, so anything is going to be better than that. I'm putting some early pressure here on Rhudaur, who would have hoped to have maybe a little bit more time to set their infantry up. So far it's only basic spears that have really taken any sort of losses, but the entire middle of that unit has been eaten away at, and so far the ambush has not yet been triggered. But yeah, we've seen recently, as I was saying, the Mirkwood infantry definitely have a big edge over the fighting men of Rhudaur. Men and women, I should say, I guess, with the Coldfell Maidens being a part of the Rhudaur army, though not today. A couple of units of the Rhudaur Axemen, of course, can pincer attack, and the Trollshaw Axe Throwers, as they move forward, they will surely be too tempting a target for the Wooden Realm Axemen. Meanwhile, the Ballista needs to be a little bit careful there, because it did get a fair amount of friendly fire as a result of targeting those units, and the shape of the engagement means that those bolts are going to carry right on through into the Elven lines. Javelins, though, and ballistae, will the morale of these Rhudaur forces hold up? Trollshaw Axe Thrower is a little bit stretched for the time being. There's 2 units of them as well by the looks of things. Trying to set themselves up. We will keep an eye on that as we whiz back over the Umbar front line once again. The Dunish warband trying to move forward, but again Umbar managing to engage them in melee, this time with the far less devastating Balagire footmen, but even so, the fact that those slings are no longer able to utilise their bullets is a win for the defenders. Some Umbar units even moving over here to try and help out against the 2 armies of Dale and Lothlorien over here, so I mean, admittedly it is their most basic of units in the Balagire footmen. And, well, there is some Alcarondas Legion over here as well, but these skin changes ripping their way through. A few of them have fallen at this point, but Dale's initial attack in danger of being completely snuffed out. Meanwhile, let's have a look over here. Yeah, the ambush was triggered. And already the Trollshaw Axe Throwers in a bit of a bad way, and also Rhudaur being completely cut off means that initial attack, the Ents arriving, a big rout. They need to be careful with that ballista fire though. They are cooking a decent amount of their own units as well. Of course, in terms of equivalency, Mirkwood will be very happy with how this initially has gone. I mean, some of those units will return because they're still so substantial, but not the start to the battle that they would have been hoping for. The Blackwolds moving forward to try and staunch the bleeding of Rhudaur's attack here, but immediately, of course, they are going to be far too tempting a target for some of Mirkwood's deadly archers. Good amounts of damage being done. Attackers already having lost half their men, I would assume. I don't think it takes routing into account with that, so it wouldn't be Rhudaur, so I would think that would be Dale. Alcarondas Legion taking a decent amount of damage here, the River Patrol in close proximity, that sort of damage, and also some of the Javelins will be hitting the Skin Changers as well, who have gotten into another unit of River Patrol, so quantity of kills here is certainly not going to be an issue for the Skin Changers. Whether this early commitment of them will prove to be the correct call or not. I mean, they're kind of scattered at this point, so regaining control of them might be a little bit dangerous, or difficult even. And this front line, Barding Herd moving forward, but without sufficient support, despite being the superior halberdier to the Shire Guard. They are looking pretty isolated at this point, looking a little bit grim for them. And now some of the battling Brandybucks on the way forward to offer a bit of armour piercing to really try and help out against the Dalians, trying to force their way through with cavalry. I mean, this is still fairly early doors for such Hail Mary-esque plays to be enacted, but I suppose if you're not going to use melee cavalry now, when will you use them? But they're already wavering, and indeed they rout. Oh, that's the general? Well, that's unfortunate. If that was the general, I'm very surprised T.S. Niehoff decided to be that gung-ho with him, but without the general, that's only going to make Dale's slightly fragile-looking morale here even worse. Trying to utilise some counter-skirmishing, but the ruffians also in position. I mean, this really is the best position on this map to defend at. Again, there's a decent choke point. It's fairly wide, is the thing you would say, so suitable pressure could break it, but the fact that you're always really going to be able to hit any sort of infantry advance in the back with your projectiles means even very basic archers are going to be fairly devastating over a long period of time. And morale is going to take hits, as we've already seen. Choke points, sight lines and elevation, all three things which defenders really do need in abundance if they're going to win a fight outnumbered, and so far things have gone pretty well for them at the start, certainly on the two flanks where the attackers have been a little bit more forthcoming, although you would say that Mirkwood's slightly lower numbers maybe is starting to be a little bit of a problem over here. That friendly fire certainly hasn't helped matters either. Again, another second ambush, which again has caused problems. The Trollshire Axe Throwers getting hit in melee again. So I was thinking that this ambush wouldn't really work as completely as Hidden was hoping it would, but clearly I was wrong. The Ents still moving forward. I mean, the Ents or Entwives, I should say, and Skin Changers obviously representing two real heavy hitters in terms of damage, both being utilised early, though the Entwives in a slightly less frantic engagement than the Skin Changers. I would imagine the Skin Changers will fall away by the late game, whereas the Entwives can be a little bit more easily preserved by the looks of things, but of course less kills to be had as well. They need to be a bit careful about being in melee with Blackwold, so the archers seem to have done the business there. Some Rhudaur swordsmen looks like they've returned from routing, trying to overrun this unit of Woodland Realm Axemen, and they should be able to do so if they manage to keep up the pressure. Meanwhile, Dunland, who last time we saw them were probably the faction in the healthiest position. I mean, it's a much more by the numbers kind of engagement, this ruffians this time for the attackers, but they haven't lost anything too important by the looks of things here, Dunland, but neither are they in any immediate danger of making any sort of progress. Even against the most basic of Umbar's units, they're not going to make progress with this level of force. They're going to need something with a bit more bite to it, but is it too early to bring the Ravenborns forward? They may need more slings, but so far this is a battle where the defenders will be pretty happy with how the initial parts of it have gone. Skin Change is actually managing to get away from this front line, maybe seeing that they've inflicted such deep wounds on the Dalian army in particular that they can pull the Skin Changers away and try and assist Umbar in the middle with the Wind Lance moving forward. We didn't really see that in action at all, really. And Dalian Royal Guard now being committed forwards. I mean, you can always tell when artillery has taken its toll on a front line. You can always see those perfectly neat rows of corpses that they tend to create. And the Dalian Royal Guard are a very strong unit, but still getting caught on the end of those Shire Guards' halberds is going to make any sort of forward momentum difficult to regain. Throwing axes still arcing over the heads of their allies. Those throwing axes are the sort of thing which can potentially turn the tide, especially Galathram Axemen, very, very damaging. And ideally suited against units like the Shire Guard as well. Two units of the Skin Changers, of course, were on the field, which the Shire can more easily go into the red limit because so much of the baseline of their army is made up of very cheap but also individually very weak units. So we've seen that several times with the Proudfoot Protectors in the past, but the Skin Changes gives them maybe a more aggressive option. And with how effective Monstrous Infantry is in this new version of the game, I can see that being something that the Shire do time and time again when we do see them on the field. Royal Guard, at the very least, holding up decently well thus far. Are Dunland making any sort of inroads? I mean, Ruffians moving forward, Danish Huntsmen, but I mean, there are some Ravenborn arriving now by the look of it, but damaged as they are, taking hits on the way forward. There's even some hobbits actually over here, a unit battling Brandybucks, using those great scythes to hew through the clansmen on the front line. So far the defenders will be happy, but we have seen many a time defenders just not have the manpower to keep this sort of thing up for a really long period of time. And with units like this, I mean, the Trollshire Axe Throwers, especially against a force like Mirkwood, if they can get a few good volleys off, that value is going to be far more telling. And they have managed to set themselves now, surviving those initial ambushes. Mirkwood, the friendly fire, of course, they will have less staying power than their allies because they are just a smaller faction in general, and those Trollshire Axe Throwers managing to get some decent hits into the very dangerous Elven King's Guard. But in response to that, this is the first time, as I was mentioning, artillery has not really been the defender's friend in recent battles, but in this one it certainly has been. I don't know how many bolts they have left, but Rhudaur will certainly be glad to see the back of this ballista. Individual hits have not been dangerous, but they have, or deadly I should say, but they have added up over time, well on the way to achieving value. Cheapest siege engine that the game has to offer as well, the ballista. Another unit of ruffians in position, maybe not quite as deadly a place as this area up here. You can see, you know, examples of the lower survivability of the hobbits, and in fact even the Corsair crossbows up here and some of the Mirkwood archers, because despite the angle, many of them did still fall, so not a complete loss for the attackers in that regard, but the damage they were able to lay down here was still too significant for their tastes, I'm sure. Alien Royal Guard still fighting hard. I mean, they are a very resilient unit, as I was saying in the composition phase, but they're not going to be able to do this all on their lonesome. Kindred of Celeborn even, one of the last ones standing last time we saw Lothlorien take to the field. Is that going to be the case this time as well? It doesn't look like it, considering they're going up against Skin Changers and are already battered and bruised. More Umbarim on the way forward. More javelins hitting their marks as well. This is the sort of fight that the elves don't tend to be able to sustain themselves in for too long. If they don't get some sort of forward momentum with the extreme damage that Lothlorien is capable of, I would suggest this fight is probably going to start to run against them fairly fast. Hiri Lung arriving on the front. Skin Changers doing their bit as well. Still, some Mirkwood units arriving as well. Again, the fact that they're able to very comfortably mix and match their options here, the defenders, is also something of a worry for the attackers. I mean, if you have a look over here, despite the fact there were two armies, there's not a huge amount left in reserve. What is here is a few Dalian units, a few Elven ones, but Dale, I think, were always going to have to be the numbers in this equation, and their army fell away far, far too quickly. Like I said, numbers can be an issue. Can Elder Pathfinders now in behind enemy lines? It's all coming up the defenders so far. Like I said, they really are going to have to lean on the fact that they have got, I mean, in particular with Dunland and Rhudaur, plentiful reserves to try and be able to outlast this storm, the attackers, but so far, no real territory gained, not any territory that the defenders did not allow them to have. Mirkwood did allow them to move forwards into the settlement a little bit after all to make the most of those ambushes. Javelins being launched up into the air. Granadine pikemen marching forward. I mean, this is a fairly substantial attack now from Rhudaur. Granadine Rangers also, 97 of them starting to return fire. 2 units of Granadine Rangers, in fact. So, I mean, those Mirkwood Rangers will definitely have been really, really damaging as well. Elder Royal Council playing their part too, so hugely damaging in addition to the ballista. Less easy to keep track of course, than those flaming bolts, but still, they are going to... I mean, they have every incentive really to move forward as quickly as they can, Rhudaur, to try and get some cover from the buildings. Need to be careful of the Great Eagles. Of course, the Great Eagles technically count as cavalry, so the Rhudaur Pike's presence on the front line will actually be a very good warding measure against them, I would imagine, unless, well, I don't really think that this is a great idea from a Texer, but we'll see how it goes, I guess. Maybe trying to go after the axe throwers that are on this flank. Looks like they're out of ammunition, otherwise there's no way they would have been committed to melee. Javelins being thrown in as well. Those that miss the Eagles will have been able to hit the Corsair Blackguards in behind. Also coming forward with the Witch Ram Enslavers. This is a big moment. If the attackers are to try and make something happen, I think they do need to gain momentum over on this side of the battlefield. Those Attenmore's Troll Hunters, ever a reliable centre to any sort of Rhudaur efforts. Another decent hit on the Elder Council in behind as well. Corsair Fencers trying to use their own throwing projectiles. Surprised actually they're not the new target of the Attenmore's Troll Hunters, considering how damaged the Elder Council already are. But Rhudaur are now forcing the defenders back bit by bit. This is going to force Umbar to send over more reinforcements. I mean, we already see the Fencers, the Axe Guard, more Alcarondas Legion, which in turn, the domino effect, should dictate that Dunland move forward with some gusto as well. It's going to be difficult considering the Naru Sentinels are now dug in, but you need to try and make something happen. If your ally in Rhudaur's attack bounces off the enemy, I think that's one defeat too many that the attackers will have sustained, and the defenders should be able to grind their way to victory. Lothlorien, meanwhile, over on this side. Great Eagles, gaps, the gaps in Lothlorien's army surely are fairly substantial. Blackshot Dragon Slayer is going to be able to do some damage. I mean, to be fair, they were able to hold the line relatively easily over here because of steady streams of reinforcements from especially Umbar, but a few units from Mirkwood as well. Now that they're facing their own challenges, the Hobbits may have to make do with what they have left on their own, and with Dale finally able to actually lay down some sort of consistent support with their archers, and with the Blackshots being the most substantial offering that they had, maybe they may not outright win this particular engagement over here, but they need to try and make it as efficient as possible, as efficient a loss as possible, unless that damage can be substantial enough to do something drastic. Ruffians on the way forward. I mean, javelin support, they don't have an ideal angle, but it is their best bet really for trying to dislodge this unit of heavy Umbar pikemen. Further back, more Ravenborn. So still some heavy hitters from Dunland that can be committed forwards. Rhudaur, meanwhile, despite a very tough opening with all that routing, have been the only ones so far to gain any sort of significant yardage within the settlement. They are still paying for this though. Some mounted Ravenborn Wardens moving forward, taking javelin hits all the while though. They're definitely picking and choosing their targets here, the defenders. I mean, we saw in the last battle it was the crossbow wielding Ravenborn that managed to see the Dunlanders over the line, so trying to ensure that that is not the case this time maybe is a wise move. Javelins managing to hit some of these units that have now managed to kind of breach the line, although the line now managing to close itself over again with the Mirkwood Silencers and the Corsair Blackguards, maybe slightly ad hoc. One Galathran Rider causing problems in behind. I mean, the Palace Guard here on the front line, and Rhudaur could scarcely hope to face a more daunting foe, especially for them. Their rank and file will really struggle. The Enslavers, more of a worthy foe, of course, and Rhudaur Pikemen will be able to try and keep them at arm's length as long as there's enough of them to do so, but their numbers are a little bit more sporadic now following the campaign of throwing knives and javelins that Rhudaur have had to try and weather. One of the Entwives still lives, still causing trouble for some of these units in behind the Rhudaur lines. Will the Swordsman manage to slay this tree? The Rangers still looking pretty healthy actually, so this is one unit that Mirkwood haven't really been able to focus down, running out of ammunition up on the hilltop, so again, it's not an ideal angle for the Rhudaur Rangers, but a bit of extra damage, especially against the kind of units that they're going to be facing over here. And of course, well, pretty much this is the last wave though, so as soon as they're out of ammunition, they will be the last ones in. And Rhudaur are starting to run out of steam a little bit, with Umbar sending over more reinforcements. Rhudaur have done what they can with a sort of throw the kitchen sink at this defensive line and hope. It's coming more and more down to whether Dunland can make something happen, I think. They have by far the most in reserve now. Ravenborn Wardens, Half-Orc Axeguard. I think maybe an issue here is that they've waited a little bit too long with these throwing projectiles. Slings and crossbows, or slings and throwing axes I should say, with the crossbows in support could have been... You may not have gotten an extremely efficient engagement with them, but just trying to do maybe more consistent damage to this Umbar front line, maybe you would be in a position now to try and do what Rhudaur have done and try one last desperate charge, but with pikes and heavy infantry in front of them, I'm not sure whether they'll have enough left in the tank. Of course, crossbows. Again, still with a bit of ammunition, that's bad news. I mean, in all fairness to Lothlorien, given the situation they were in over here, they've actually lasted longer than I thought they would. Of course, as soon as I say that, the Lothlorien general does fall, but again, a little bit of support coming in from those ranged units. Mounted Ravenborn Warden's going to try their thing as well. The Windlance, I mean, managing to remount, this could be absolutely huge. This is the sort of win that the attackers sorely need at this point, because they could absolutely devastate this fighting front line, and it's not full of the most important defensive units at this point. You can see there the Windlance piercing through. A big rout could be helpful. If they are able to fight the defenders to a standstill over here, it will at least give them a puncher's chance in the other theatres, but to be able to do so, I mean, 1 point blank volley is all well and good, but is that truly going to suffice? What's going on there? Well, they were routing for a second then, but no, they're pursuing the Windlance crew, which are in fact routing. What very little remains of the Galathrun Nobles and the Blackshot Dragon Slayers, the strongest of Lorien and Dale's units, will fight to the bitter end, but again, it's always been a tough ask. From those early stages of the battle over on this side, it was looking pretty doubtful the attackers would be able to make an efficient victory happen, and indeed it seems as though a victory is not going to happen at all. Umbar's front line over here, meanwhile, has stayed steadfast in the face of Dunland, and when it comes down to... well, there goes the Rhudaur general. But when it comes down to just a straight-up engagement in a choke point, you'd back Umbar every day against Dunland. Dunland, like I said, they haven't really been able to use their projectiles quickly enough, you would suggest. A couple of units of Ravenborn on the way forward now, but I think Umbar's front line is maybe still too sturdy. More to the point, if Rhudaur fall before Dunland really are able to utilise those Ravenborn, Elder Pathfinders, Rhudaur, their efforts collapse. Miho 2 fell victim to those two makeshift ambushes early, and it set the stage really. The Ballista and the archers from Mirkwood doing their thing as well, and when you add up those factors, considering the kind of infantry matchup Mirkwood versus Rhudaur is, I don't envy Miho 2's task in this fight. I mean, Rhudaur, they've revealed an awful lot of units at this point, but I mean, if they had revealed these a little bit sooner, if they had done this when Rhudaur were attacking, it may have been something that Umbar would have been genuinely more worried about, but now it coincides almost too perfectly really with Rhudaur's defeat, so Umbar and what remains of Mirkwood are going to be able to come over to try and shore that line up. Is it going to be enough to have that left in reserve? Beastmen of Dunland are pretty savage as a unit, as we have seen. Meanwhile, in all fairness, they've siphoned off a lot of the units over here as well, to the point where actually the remnants of the Blackshots and the Galathrun may actually win. They certainly will with the support of those 14 bowmen, you would suggest, so maybe all is not lost over here. You'd have thought that Dale and Lothlorien may still have a hand in who goes on to win this fight. Half-orc throwing axes, banking their shots. I mean, a bit of a mass push going on here. Corsair fencers doing their thing. I mean, in the vanguard here, the Ravenborn with the Beastmen. Two very damaging units. This is Dunland, as perhaps they should have been a little bit earlier. And indeed, the Umbar reinforcements actually weren't able to get themselves sat on the front line in time to prevent this from happening. So a more chaotic fight is definitely what Dunland will want in this situation, to make sure that those Umbar pikes didn't get sat and keep them at arm's length as they have done throughout most of this battle so far. But the Ravenborn will be good against disparate units of Rhudaur, or at least efficient, big armour-piercing swings against the Umbar plate. Do Dunland have what it takes though against stuff like Elder Royal Council? Still a decent number of Palace Guard left alive. I mean, all that applies to the Rhudaur infantry against Mirkwood also applies to Dunland, if not more so, really. Beastmen of Dunland still doing their thing, which Roman slavers, I thought they were still there, but they're actually routing. Can they get these slings into position? Can the Warlord be the hero his team needs? All of those units that revealed themselves, mostly Beastmen of Dunland actually, and Half-Orc Axguard also, 2 units of them, trying to coax the defenders into using all of their resources, certainly would have been the Warlord's thinking here. Again, I think the difference between victory and defeat here, we'll be able to judge whether it was the right call, or whether they should have marched in step with Rhudaur a little bit more. 51 Royal Council, Ballista crew fighting. I don't know if they have any bolts remaining anyway, but a couple of Ravenborn getting in the way of them. I mean, it says defeat seems certain for the defenders, which is presumably down to the numbers that Dunland still have. Only half of casualties has just been reached. Beastmen of Dunland now having to, or well, I mean, it's mostly they need to try and ensure if the Half-Orc Axguard have any ammunition left whatsoever, that they can't use it, the defenders. I mean, then the Elder Royal Council, one of the more ideal units for trying to ensure that that is indeed not the case. Proudfoot Protectors. I don't know whether they actually use their ammunition up on one of those defensive positions or not, but they're having to utilise their pikes anyway, as the Dunnish Warband and Half-Orc Axguard circumvent the frontline fight, which is still ongoing. Those numbers, I mean, the initial punch that the Beastmen and the Ravenborn have offered Dunland here is pretty substantial. It was a more limited Umbar frontline in terms of numbers, not in terms of quality or indeed preparedness, but they weren't quite able to get those reinforcements back across in time. The engagement has widened as a result. They still have those Ravenborn Wardens as well, who presumably still have a few bolts left in reserve. Ruffians on the way forward. Again, you could question the quality of some of these units. Elder Pathfinders moving across, so I think this is probably where Dale and what remains of Lothlorien's sort of late, I wouldn't call it a resurgence, but defiance here in the late game probably will come to an end. They simply don't have the numbers. These Corsair crossbowmen there, and the Pathfinders still finding their use by tidying that potential mess up. So, will it be again? I mean, this was the very unit that won it for the attackers last time. The Ravenborn Wardens, can they do it again? Of course, they themselves are sturdy enough in melee that if it comes down to a handful of units, they may very well be able to fight their way to victory then as well. Also, Blackguards fighting hard. I mean, there are more individual instances now of that Umbar quality, and I mean, they may not have been able to set themselves up in the position they would have wanted, but these Rhudaur Sentinels still managing to set themselves up in a fighting line. A bit of Elven support in here as well, and as deadly as that initial push was, we may be starting to see a little bit of faltering. Victory still within Dunland's grasp for now. It would be a remarkable turnaround, because throughout most of this battle The momentum was squarely in the defenders' favour, but this late game surge from Dunland, I mean, in all fairness, Dale and Lothlorien were very aggressive early on, then it was Rhudaur's turn, and now Dunland, so in sequence, 1, 2, 3. Will that be enough? Or would a more joined up approach have worked better? Typically it's when you're in sync. So it'd be interesting if this more sequential approach actually wins the day here. Beastman charging into the Mirkwood Rangers, landing that charge. These are the small victories which could prove key. What's going on over here? I was going to say Witchram enslavers have been routing all over the place at this point. They've done a grand tour, really, of the entire outpost before finally deciding to flee. Ruffians also routing. Dunlanding clansmen. I mean, a rout is not the sort of thing that Dunland can afford here, and they need the numbers of the warband and the clansmen to help the position of the Ravenborn. Umbar starting to struggle in terms of numbers here. Ravenborn Wardens. The Umbar General falls. Umbar, of course, and the Nara Aru are locked morale, and many of their units are very high morale anyway, so it's not the end of the world, but we're getting close to it. We can see it from here. Elder Pathfinders charging in. I mean, this envelopment that the Ravenborn have also been able to enact has been pretty key, and I mean, it's looking grim for the defenders, you have to say. They are going to need... I mean, they're certainly going to need these Ravenborn Wardens to not fire, but the loss of the General, shanked by those Proudfoot protectors, and I mean, the Proudfoots are doing their bit in making sure that at least the whole unit can't fire their payload. Still some Blackshot Dragon Slayers as well. Ballista crew. The loss of the General could be vital, and indeed, here we go, like a rout. Ravenborn run. The Clansmen run, the Danish Warband. I think with that, that's going to be the end. Morale killing them, and that was, I mean, the loss of the General had to have played its part there. A big part as well. Mirkwood's General falls, but again, the difference between a high morale faction generally and a low one. You may have the numbers, but individually those troops are not of the highest quality, physically or mentally. And that is the difference here, because I think without the loss of the General, if they were able to keep him safe, just a couple of sort of half volleys from those Ravenborn could well have been enough to tip the numbers too far out of the defenders' favour. But that one hobbit that managed to run the Dunland chief through is the hero of the hour, you would have to say. Very close, a far closer battle actually than it looked like it was going to be in the mid-game. And like I said, when the attackers can just bring forward more reserves, it really is a test of endurance when you're the defenders and more armies are on the attack, and it's a test that on this occasion the defenders are going to pass. And the Ravenborn, like I said, I mean, late on, if it came down to a very narrow margin, their strength in melee could have maybe been enough, but not considering the odds they're now facing. Still a few Umbar pikes kicking around. Blackguards, but there is still the Elder Royal Council, I think. Cutting down fleeing men as they are, but are they trying to pad their kill counts, mayhaps? They're not going to have much longer left to be able to do that, considering we're in the final 300 frames. And that is going to be that. Routing, victory, and 1% the difference as well. These last two siege battles that we've shown have both had a differential of only 1%. And you can't ask for more than that from a competitive siege. Probably one of the best, certainly one of the most competitive games that we've seen on the ADUNAIM outpost, as we go through some of these older, slightly more classic maps perhaps. And yeah, unsurprisingly, the elves pulling out the most kills again, as they have in. They do tend to do that in many a siege battle, because of course they do have that ranged strength, And obviously up front, up close and personal as well, especially considering most of who they were facing will have been Dunland and Rhudaur. That is a good matchup for Mirkwood infantry, but majority I think is their support. We'll see in a moment. Umbar, I mean, Dunland waited and bided their time more so than the other factions, so it's not too surprising to see Red Knight got the least kills for the defenders as well, because he had to play the waiting game, and by the time Dunland did move forward, it was all hands on deck really. And the Hobbits, of course, had the initial fight against two factions primarily, against which they had to be the driving force. So again, good amount of kills there. Very similar amounts of kills actually for all the attackers, which is not too surprising as well, because we did see a bit of a mix and match kind of approach from the defenders, and Dale and Lothlorien, of course, facing off against the Hobbits means that, you know, the Hobbits were the bigger army in the first place. Although Umbar actually had quite a few men deployed as well, certainly in comparison to Mirkwood. I mean, what did the damage for Mirkwood? Plenty of units with very high kills, of course. Pathfinders did their bit here and there throughout the battle. Like I was saying, this is one of the better examples of defensive siege that we've seen in a while, with 464 kills on the ballista. Elder Royal Council, of course, were active even in the late game, so 428 is a good return from them. Elven King's Guard doing well, Mirkwood Rangers doing okay. Elder Council, I mean, like I said, I was maybe a little bit critical of them in the deployment phase, but again, getting over 100 kills, one nearly 200, that's a decent return, especially in a throwing projectile match against the likes of Rhudaur, but Entwise breaking 400 kills, Elder Palace Guard getting 516 in pure melee. Again, it goes to show how good, you know, Mirkwood's infantry can be against those more lightly armoured human factions, because they're able to deploy the full amount of their damage, and of course they themselves with their high melee defense, it's as long as you get an efficient engagement of sufficient size and you're not getting overrun too quickly and not getting pushed out of the way because of your lightweight, if you can fix them in that kind of engagement, the kills you can get are very, very high. And the Palace Guard, of course, very good example of that. Differing maybe fates for the heavier units, but still some of them 336 kills on Hiri Lan. Woodland Realm Axeman, that little ambush that was set up was also very important, and based on the narrow margins descended with, these are the things which ultimately did decide the battle, you would have to suggest. Mirkwood's silence is maybe not quite as good, but still. Yeah, big thank you to Hidden for sending this one in, another one to add to the sort of reunion tour of classic maps that used to make up really a regular rotation. I hope that we don't return to the days of only playing on a handful of like 4 or 5 maps and those being the vast majority of what people play. It hasn't really been the case for a while, and it's part of the reason why I'm actually quite glad to see some of these maps return, so that we can show them one more time ahead of the release of the new patch. But like I said, obviously new maps are definitely the lifeblood going forward. And yeah, big thanks to all the players as well for being a part of this battle replay. Many familiar faces in here, although not Miho too. Don't recognise that name. But yes, I believe, based on the way that the schedule has panned out, this will be the first video that comes after the channel update that I did, detailing the fact that the re-expansion of the schedule is a permanent affair, at least for the time being. So yeah, like I said, Wednesdays, Saturdays, going to be sort of guaranteed videos for the time being, as long as, of course, I can actually fill those positions with suitable content. Speaking of which, I believe the next one is going to be another tournament battle on the Wednesday, and then following on from that, we've got another fresh custom map, actually. This one, I believe, going to be Arnor and Gondor, the reunited kingdom, facing on the defence against a force of orcs, so that will be a lore-friendly battle on a completely brand new map. And similar story, actually, following on from that as well, albeit it's an evil-themed defensive map with a more eastern men Candish settlement, which is going to be under attack by a variety of good aligned factions. So those will be the 2 next weekend slot videos. And then, I mean, I have to do those first because there's going to be a mini update, I think, for the tournament build. So I'll have to do all of those first, and then we'll get back on track with doing other bits and pieces. Well, Last Alliance sprinkled in here as well. But I think enough rambling from myself. Thank you to Hidden once again and all the players for being a part of this one. Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.